So good morning, everybody. I'm Alicia Harvey from Farm Aid, and we're really glad to see all of your faces and to have you all on with us. So we have people from all around the country, including Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and really this is a community of folks who are working with us in distributing relief funds across the country to farmers in the midst of COVID. So this is for you and your staff and really people who are in the midst of working with farmers, either as service providers or in your own membership. And this webinar is heavily grounded in programs and helping everybody here understand many different kinds of programs that folks need to know farmers are eligible for and are available to them. But at the top of the conversation, we want to kind of do a little bit of framing, which is the following. There are aspects of what we're all experiencing with COVID that are very specific to a pandemic disaster. There are other aspects of it that are textbook natural disaster recovery. And so what we wanted to do was really bring forward some of the analysis of those of us who have done disaster recovery work with farm populations over the last several decades, because we think a lot of that analysis helps inform what we understand about what you're going to be experiencing and how we need to brace ourselves for what's to come. So one thing we want to lift up is that disasters become existential moments for farms and ranches of all kinds. They are a moment through which, for many different reasons, we can lose farms. If not in the immediate aftermath, in the year or two afterwards, because of how farms dig into their reserves and equity to get through the moment, and because the fallout from poor program implementation, from people being denied things that they were actually eligible for, has ripple effects down the road for the farms. And so this is to say that we ask you not to underestimate your power in the work you're doing with farmers day in, day out in providing accurate information and in spending that extra minute with the farmer. It really can be the difference between saving that farm and not. And so this is really a moment where all of us are being called to do the most we can for the farms in our midst. The other thing I want to just bring up is, and we're not going to go over this in depth, but just want to know, we have some links to this in your materials, that there are sort of commonly understood stages of recovery that a lot of folks in the disaster profession bring forward to understand. There are also communities of practitioners who overlay this with emotional or stress roller coasters that happen during these different periods. And we'll be working with other communities of folks to sort of integrate that perspective into this understanding of disaster recovery. But what it's all to say is that after a certain point of time, there becomes a moment where outside agencies withdraw, where communities feel disillusioned, where it becomes important to acknowledge what the embedded community organizations like yourselves, how important you are to the long-term recovery and reconstruction for your communities over time. And so we just want to let you know that there is already existing frameworks out there for understanding the time lapse of recovery. And you and your organizations, many of you are leaders of your organizations, so start thinking about that and start thinking about how you're also going to support your staff over time. The last thing I just want to share with you all before I pass it over to our friends at Farmers Legal Action Group is that there is an emotional and stress aspect to what we're all going through. Oftentimes, it's going to be directed at you as people working with farmers. It's not about you, but folks' anguish and frustration and exhaustion might get directed towards you. And what we also see over time is that the emotional patterns that show up in frontline communities, the farmers, the farm workers, the people you care about, also start showing up in you and your staff. And so start knowing and start thinking about how to prep, because this is universal. This is not a disaster where it hit one community. We're all in it, which means we all need to have some awareness when we're in leadership roles of what's unfolding and what we're all stepping into. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Stephen Carpenter from Farmers Legal Action Group, who is going to begin to sort of bring us through this guide that they've put together to help you all and give you all the most amount of information you can have. Just a reminder that if you have questions as we go, please put them in the chat box. Take it away, Stephen.
Hey there, this is Stephen at Farmers Legal Action Group. I'm going to be talking a bit about sort of right now about the logic of the guide to a farmer's guide to COVID-19 relief that you should have a link to. That's a flag publication. And so what I wanted to do just for a few moments is talk a bit about sort of the logic of the guide and what we were thinking about it as ways that it might be useful. I know that almost everybody out there knows of Farmers Legal Action Group, but I'll just say, as if not, that we're a nonprofit law firm that works on behalf of family farmers. And this is a core piece of our work to make sure that farmers understand their rights and that organizations like yours get supported with a bit of legal background. So with that said, we wrote this guide. I warn everybody over and over, it's dry as dust, but our hope is that it's useful. And so the logic of it is, you know, we've got a major crisis on our hands. Nobody doubts that. We also have now an array of programs which in theory are designed to help people get through the crisis. Some of them are just for everybody, some are for farmers, some aren't for farmers. But they're confusing, and they're confusing because they are formed on the fly. They involve a lot of different organizations. The rules are coming out very rapidly, and I think it's fair to say chaotically. And everything is happening fast. So what we tried to do was write something that would give farmers an understanding of what their rights were to all these programs, and also you, advocates, people who work with farmers, people who do policy work, an idea of what the programs actually do and what their limitations are. So when you look at the guide, it's in theory, I hope, has a family farmer perspective. It's detailed and we hope authoritative. That is to say, if we make a statement, we try to back it up in a footnote with some authority. So you can track that down and make use of it. It's in theory accessible, I hope. It doesn't read like the Federal Register, I hope. And we should add too that this is our second edition already. Things are changing so rapidly. We will try to keep up with changes. There are whole pieces like the USDA programs that we're about to hear about that we don't even know the rules for yet. And as those rules come out, we will write more. There's also to be a 3-page summary of this. That's sort of a joint Farm Aid, RAFI flag effort that will be sort of a shorter outline of all this. And I would say also that we're open for questions in the medium and long term. Lindsay, who you're going to hear from as well, and I drafted this, and we want it to be useful, and that means answering follow-up questions for things that were confusing. And so with that said, Sarah Hackney at National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition has the inside scoop on USDA programs and all the money they're going to give out.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'll say too, appreciate all that you all in FLAG are doing and Farm Aid and everybody else on this call. It's nice to see so many familiar faces and names. So hey everybody, my name is Sarah Hackney. I'm the Coalition Director at the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition based in Washington, DC. So I'm gonna spend no more than 5 minutes here up the top of this call on the still anticipated direct USDA farmer aid. So the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, or CFAP as we're calling it, is the centerpiece of USDA's relief plan, which is funded by the CARES Act, and it consists of two components. $16 billion anticipated to go out as direct payments for farmers, and $3 billion in direct purchases of meat, dairy, and specialty crops for emergency food boxes through what's being called the Farmers to Families Food Box Program. I'm going to focus today on the direct farmer aid side. For folks interested in or working on the food box side, your best bet is to visit our website, sustainableagriculture.net. I'll drop a link in the chat box. And check out our blog post that has a lot of details on the program, including eligibility as regarding community-based organizations, food hubs, everybody else. The RFP is open. The window for that side of the program closes for folks to apply on May 1st. That's Friday. So for the direct aid portion of CFAP, USDA plans to distribute payments to farmers based on actual losses where prices, markets, and supply chains have been impacted by the pandemic. Really important top line note, it's not yet open. So let me start with some things we don't know. We do not know when we will actually see the program details to fully analyze, understand it, and begin preparing to assist producers. So that's one thing we do not know yet. Best guess timing, USDA has drafted those program rules. One report suggests they're sent to the White House, to the Office of Management and Budget for review, but we haven't seen them yet. We doubt we will see them this week, could be as early as next week. We do not know when the program will open or how long they will keep it open, including if it will be truly first come, first serve, or if it will have a fixed application window. We anticipate the very earliest that it could open would be early to mid-May. That's our best guess. Again, that could shift. We also do not yet have full details on how producers will apply or what fully will be asked of them to determine their eligibility. I recognize that's probably frustrating for you. It is for us too. So for today, I am going to share a few things that we think we know about the program, but I'm going to err on the side of saying we don't know where we don't rather than speculate. And again, last piece, a lot of what I'm sharing here is also available on our website, so I'll post a link in the chat box afterward. So, fun details. Who is eligible? Initial reports suggest that they're going to allocate funding by commodity, and they designated funding for livestock, for dairy, for row crops, for specialty crops, including fruit and vegetables, and for other crops, so things like horticulture, nurseries. While it seems that most producers will be eligible for funding, provided they can demonstrate an actual loss, it is unclear fully how funding will be divided. We have only unconfirmed reports from Senator Hovind's office on those dollar figures. Also unclear is how diversified producers who may cross some of those commodity categories, farmers who sell primarily into local and regional markets, farmers who may not have an existing relationship with USDA, farmers with access barriers, for example, folks for whom English is not their primary language, will be able to apply. At this time, we believe they have not reserved or dedicated any funding for historically underserved farmer groups, including farmers of color. This is a serious concern. We also do not yet know if farmers will be required to have a farm number to apply for aid. We do not yet know. One thing that we are hopeful and optimistic on is with regarding the relationship between this USDA aid and Small Business Administration aid, including the PPP and EIDL programs that are going to come up shortly. At this time, we do not expect that if a producer receives that SBA aid, that they would be rendered ineligible for USDA aid. That is unconfirmed. We do not know for sure, but our expectation is that receiving one will not render them ineligible for the aid. What can a farmer be paid for from USDA? Their plan is to compensate folks for actual losses. So that is losses you can document that connect back to the pandemic. How much funding might a farmer get? USDA has indicated that there are going to be standard payment limits that apply. They're under pressure to release them, but they are some payment limits. You can find details in our blog post. And that they're going to prioritize losses incurred from January through April of this year. Some quick takeaways right now. I know I'm at my 5 minutes, and I'm sure you all are already getting farmer questions. We would really strongly encourage producers, let them know we don't have all the answers yet. They should stay plugged in with you so they can get information quickly when it's available. They should be ready to apply as quickly as they are able. And they should be working now to gather documentation of loss that they can. That's going to relate to all the programs that folks are about to go through. 2 quick advocacy notes as well. We're encouraging farmers to go ahead and be calling FSA, Farm Service Agency offices now, to ask questions about eligibility and need to help get issues on their radar. We've drafted some questions. I'll put a link in the chat box. Likewise, advocacy opportunities are not over. I highlighted a ton of possible issues and unknowns about the program. We'll keep you in the loop on opportunities to be involved. That's it for me. Expect that things will change, lots of uncertainty. I wish I had more answers. We're here with you through this. We're gonna keep working on it together. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Stephen.
Thank you. If people don't know it already, the highlight of your week should be on Friday when NSAC's listserv announcement comes out of what's gone on for the week. And it's always good to check the blog. They do a great job of coherently keeping up with what's going on day to day, week to week in this world that we care about. With that said, on your outline, if you have it in front of you, we're going to start going through some of these topics, and we are going to try to keep it brisk, and we're going to love to answer questions at the end, and we'll do everything we can to stay on to get those answered. And again, if questions come up later, please feel free to contact Lindsay or me regarding the stuff that we're talking about and related to the book, and we'll follow up with you. So Roman numeral 5 talks about the individual recovery rebates, or people are calling them economic impact payments. There's really not anything particular to say about farmers here. This is the Treasury checks that everybody talks about and knows about. The one thing that I would add before we move on is that creditors can seize this money if it's in your bank account. I mean, we've been assured that Treasury and USDA won't offset the payments from if you owe the government money or FSA money, but that doesn't stop any other creditors. So if people are worried about money sitting in their bank account, or if they should be worried, that money can disappear through a creditor action, which of course is relevant for farmers. With that, we're going to move now to the Small Business Administration, which is super important for these relief programs. People that are longer and medium-term activists on family farms and sustainable farm issues will know that SBA hasn't done much for agriculture ever, really. They don't have an especially good understanding of agriculture, don't really want to work with farmers, and when they have, they've often shown poor judgment about how to proceed. But with that kind thought to begin with, let's go to the programs themselves, and Lindsay, take it away.
Thanks, Stephen. Hello, everyone. My name is Lindsay Keene. I work with Stephen at FLAG, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about 2 of the big programs that were rolled out originally in the CARES Act. That's the Paycheck Protection Program, or the PPP program. And then we have the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, the EIDL program. And as Stephen mentioned, the rollout of these has been chaotic and confusing in many respects. And in part, that's because the funding for these programs has come in 2 waves. So the CARES Act had initial funding for each of them. And then for both programs, that funding ran out in a matter of weeks. And then on April 24th, Congress passed another act called the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act, which for the sake of brevity, I'll just call the Enhancement Act. And that act put in more money to both programs. So that has been somewhat confusing, and then so many different rules have come out for, in most cases, the Paycheck Protection Program, and very little has come out for the EIDL program. So with all that said, there's a lot of confusion, but my goal is to tell you what we do know, so that as you're working with farmers, you kind of have a baseline for where we're at currently. So I'm going to start with the PPP program, Paycheck Protection Program. And this is a program that the intent of it is to help employers and businesses retain their employees. So they provide loans that can be 100% forgivable to, so long as employers retain their employees during that time. And this is based on an 8-week period, an 8-week payroll period. One thing to note about this program, although it's under the SBA, people would actually apply through their banks. So this is a program where Banks and lenders are providing the loan to borrowers, and then the federal government is guaranteeing that, so they will pay the banks back for that money. Under this program, the deadline to apply is June 30th, in theory, though as I mentioned a minute ago, the initial funding, which was $349 billion in the CARES Act, that money ran out in mid-April, and an additional $310 billion has been added, and the loans for that began being accepted just this past Monday on April 27th. So the question is obviously, how long will this money last? And we don't know. So I would encourage, keep that in mind, that it's probably best to apply sooner rather than later. So that gets to the eligibility. And the main thing to point out here is farmers, ranchers, agricultural producers, they are all eligible for this program. There's a few ways that can happen, and our guide goes into more details about those requirements. I think for the purposes of this conversation, the key things are that small businesses, so generally those with 500 or fewer employers, are going to be eligible, and nonprofits, veterans organizations, tribal business concerns. But then another key part is that you can be a self-employed person, a sole proprietor, or an independent contractor and also be eligible. And this is where it is likely that a lot of farmers that you all are working with, this is the category they're gonna fall within. So I'm gonna spend a couple minutes talking about the main eligibility requirements for those self-employed people. There are 4 general requirements. And the first one is that for a self-employed person, including a farmer, to apply for PPP and to be eligible, you need to have been in operation on February 15th of this year. So February 15th of 2020. You also need to have self-employment income, and that can come from being a sole proprietor or an independent contractor. You need to have your principal place of residence in the United States. And then the 4th requirement, and this is one that I'm going to spend a little time talking about because it's been somewhat confusing, is that you need to have filed or intend to file a 2019 IRS Form 1040 Schedule C. And basically, for those who aren't familiar, the Schedule C is the form that most self-employed individuals will file to show their income and expenses. The question that we had, and I'm guessing a lot of you have, is, well, what does that mean for farmers? Because as we know, most farmers do not file a Schedule C. They file a Schedule F. And so this is where I want to kind of walk through briefly what has developed in regards to that. So on April 20th, a rule came out in the Federal Register that described the eligibility requirements for self-employed people who file Schedule C. And that was the only schedule that was mentioned in that rule. So it was very narrow in one respect. A few days later, on the 24th of this month, the Treasury Department, and I cannot explain why it's the Treasury Department, but they issued some guidance explaining that for farmers who file a Schedule F, they can use that form in place of a Schedule C and still follow the eligibility rules that were outlined for Schedule C filers. So in other words, the point I'm trying to make is that if you are working with farmers who file a Schedule F, they are eligible for the Paycheck Protection Program, and they can use the information on that form, and in fact, they'll need to provide that form when they apply, but they can use it in a similar manner as other people who are applying with a Schedule C, how they would go about the process. And there's more, our guide kind of walks through more details on that, and if there are questions on that, because it's a bit confusing, we'll be happy to answer them at the end of this. But the key point, another key point I want to make with this is that the way the rules for PPP are designed, you can only, again, I said this is a loan that in theory is 100% forgiven if you follow the requirements, and the way they determine your eligibility is based on your net income, or your net profit, excuse me. So they look at the Schedule C, again, for a self-employed person, and they would look and see what your net profit is. If it is 0 or less, you are not eligible for the PPP program. So this means that for farmers who file a Schedule F, similarly, if it does not show on their Schedule F a net profit, if it's 0 or less, they are not going to be eligible for this program. And as we all know, that could mean a lot of farmers are not going to be eligible on that basis. So that is something that's important to keep in mind. For those who are eligible and do get the loan, you can use it for payroll expenses. That is an eligible use. And in fact, at least 75% of the loan needs to be used for those costs in order for it to be forgiven. And then other things include rent, utility, and mortgage interest. So all of those are eligible uses. Any part of the loan that you do not use for those purposes will have a 1% interest rate that you can pay back over the course of 2 years. So that's sort of the quick and dirty of the Paycheck Protection Program. And the last thing I want to note on this, if any of you happen to work with farmers who are contract poultry or hog farmers, there are some, SBA has a history of having what they call affiliation rules. And so there is an overlay of those rules with the Paycheck Protection Program. And I would say if you have questions on that, go ahead and ask them, and we'll kind of use the Q&A time to address those. But just to put a heads up that there could be issues related to that. Okay, so that is our PPP program. I want to briefly now talk about the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, so EIDL. This was another program that was first rolled out in the CARES Act. And unlike the Paycheck Protection Program, there was a similar program in existence with SBA. And for those who are familiar, it would be the 7B loans. And those are loans that are generally made after natural disasters. So what the CARES Act did is it both modified and expanded the EIDL program. So it said that instead of just a natural disaster, making you eligible, now the pandemic, COVID-19, can make you eligible for an EIDL loan. It also, so that's one part of this program. The second part is that they have what they call emergency advances or emergency grants. And those can be up to $10,000. And the key is that you do not need to repay that. So there are two aspects of this program, and there, in theory, is some good money there. But up until now, that money has not been available to farmers. And this is what's, I think, really important for this group to understand. When the CARES Act rolled out, this program excluded what SBA calls agricultural enterprises. And there's kind of some history to that, but the important point was that most farmers, with the exception of some nurseries and aquaculture enterprises and small ag co-ops, most farmers could not apply for this program. But jump ahead to the Enhancement Act, which again passed on April 24th. More money was funneled into the EIDL program. And importantly, it expressly now says that agricultural enterprises are eligible. And I'm actually just going to go ahead and read that definition because it's specific under SBA rules and it's quite broad. So I have a feeling this would apply to most farmers. So under the Act, an agricultural enterprise, it includes those small business concerns engaged in the production of food and fiber, ranching and raising of livestock, aquaculture, and all other farming and agricultural related industries. So it's a very broad definition. And so what this, again, with the EIDL, which we've just established, now makes farmers eligible. What it does, you can either get a loan that would be up to a 30-year loan with either a 3.7% interest rate or a 2.75%, and if you're a nonprofit. Unlike the PPP, the loan aspect of this program is not forgiven. So this is purely just a loan. The $10,000 emergency grant that you can also apply for, that, again, if you get it, you don't need to pay it back, but there are certain limitations on what you can use that money for. And this is where there's a little crossover with the PPP program. So you can use that money similarly with PPP. You can use it for payroll, rent, utilities, and also any debts that the business has incurred that it can't pay back because of COVID-19. So that's for the grant. Those are the uses. I think it's important to note, so when the Enhancement Act extended it to agricultural enterprises, it also increased the funding for this program. There is an additional $50 billion for the loans themselves and an additional $10 billion for the grants. However, and this is the really, I guess, unfortunate part and the big unknown, is that at this time, SBA has said that they are not accepting new applications for the EIDL program. And this is important because unlike the PPP where you go to your banks to apply, for the EIDL, you have to apply directly through SBA and on their website. And what they are saying is that for those who applied for an EIDL previously, and remember that would not include most farmers, they are going to, with this additional funding, they are going to continue working through those applications on a first-come, first-served basis. They have not said if and when they will reopen that for new applications, including those from farmers. And the only word I can come up with is really sloppy, but if you look at SBA's website, for example, yesterday they had a notice that said, we will be releasing more information for borrowers such as agricultural enterprises. Today that language is not there. So I don't know what that means. I don't know if it has any significance, but the reality remains that we know there's additional funding for the program. We know most farmers can be eligible, but we also know that at this time, SBA is not accepting new applications. So I would say for you all to just keep looking on SBA's website because that's where it will be posted, and I'm sure a lot of the organizations here are going to be informing people as well. But as soon as they start taking applications again, it would be in the farmer's best interest to apply right away because the money has already run out for both of these programs, and it is likely that that's going to happen again. So I don't know if, Stephen, if there's anything else you want to chime in on that. Otherwise, that's kind of the summary of those two programs.
Nope, sounds good. If it sounds complicated, that's because it is. And if it sounds like there's a little bit of an odd catch-22 for farmers only becoming eligible once the money ran out for EIDL, you're right, it is. But hopefully there'll be more money and we're all gonna try to stay on top of it. With that, let's move on to pandemic unemployment insurance. This is a provision that was in the CARES Act. You'll remember the massive expansion of unemployment that was done by Congress. That gives you 13 more weeks, up to 39 weeks. It increased the payment, $600 a week, all to the good. The interesting thing from our perspective is that it made self-employed individuals eligible for unemployment during the pandemic. And so what's confusing about all this is that the unemployment offices that normally run unemployment, which is going to be typically the state, continue to administer, though Department of Labor does oversight, and then you have this extra money from Congress. So technically, farmers are eligible as self-employed, unemployed. Your state may or may not understand that concept. This is borrowed from disaster unemployment assistance. Unemployment offices that are used to that, maybe they'll get it. In the past, we've had difficulty convincing state unemployment offices that farmers can be eligible, but if they'll just look at their own rules, they will find that's the case. The thing that I would add to this, and this is explained in the book, in a guide, is it's a little bit odd the way they decide whether you are unable to work because of COVID-19. And this would apply to farmers as well. And some of it's kind of obvious, if you're sick, if you're the primary caregiver, etc. What's a little bit more confusing and tenuous is what happens if you've, say, lost a market, or does that mean you're unable to work? And the rules are unclear. We think that people should aggressively seek out this unemployment assistance and argue that the Department of Labor's information leads one to conclude that farmers might well be included. Because what labor says is, here's their example, that if you're doing rideshare work and you no longer can do that, hey, you're out of a job even though you're self-employed or you're working on a contract. So we think if you're a farmer and your market just completely disappeared, you're similarly should be eligible for unemployment. That's nothing written in stone. That's our attempt to work through the rules. Again, you've got people in charge who don't really have a sense of agriculture, but I think it's worth the effort for farmers to try this. It's not a ton of money, but it's real money, and why not? with that, let's move to what on your screen is Chapter 8, or number 8. This is also something from the so-called CARES Act, a foreclosure moratorium and forbearance. And this you have to sort of work through a little bit piece by piece. Essentially what's happening here is that Congress is protecting residents, people who have a mortgage on their residence, from being booted out of their homes is the main theory. So to go through it step by step, you're eligible for this if you have a federally backed residential mortgage. Well, what's federally backed mean? It could be a VA mortgage, a FHA mortgage, a HUD mortgage, or a USDA mortgage. Or if it's backed, that means it was bought by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. So parsing through all that, you know, some 2/3 of all the home mortgages in the country are covered by this. What do you get? You have a moratorium on foreclosure for 180 days. This is a good thing. I mean, excuse me, you get forbearance on your loans for 180 days. My mistake here. And so what that means is if you say you have a financial hardship, you don't have to pay on your mortgage for 180 days. And they can't take action against you because of it. You can also renew it for another 180 days. So if you qualify for this, basically, you're not going to get penalized for not paying on your mortgage for, you know, if you do everything properly, a year. So it doesn't mean the debt goes away. It just means you don't have to pay it now. The second thing that you get if you qualify for this is a foreclosure moratorium, and that lasts into mid-May. That means they can't go forward with a foreclosure to kick you out of your home. And one would hope Congress will extend that one of these days. As it stands right now, it lasts for 60 days, beginning March 18th. So coming up in mid-May, it would end unless it's extended by Congress. For our purposes, the super important point is, what does this mean for farmers and people with mortgaged homes that live on a farm? And we have concluded that all the administrative agencies who are implementing this believe that a federally backed mortgage for a residence does not include a residence where the mortgage also includes farmland. And one should add that Farmer Mac is not one of the securitizing agencies that creates a federally backed mortgage. So what this means, the way this is being operated, is that if you have a rural housing loan with the USDA, you're protected by this. If, on the other hand, you have an FSA FO loan, a real estate loan, that is a mortgage on your home, but also includes farmland, you are not protected by it. So it's a very odd carve out that they have made, which one way to look at it is that for every federally backed mortgage in the country, you cannot be foreclosed on and you have a forbearance unless your mortgage also includes a significant farmland. So it's kind of an ugly moment here where farmers are treated worse than everybody else. But that's the way it is. There are going to be a few farmers that qualify for this because your residence has a mortgage that doesn't include a lot of farmland.
There's, Stephen, there's
yes.
a few questions that I want just to lift up on this from the chat. One question is basically, I think, does a forbearance extend the note? So do we know anything about how?
No, all it does is you don't have to pay now.
So it kind of balloons.
Well, and what's confusing about this is there's no real rules. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, there's a link here to their discussion of it. They don't have any power to implement it. I mean, it's a little bit open question, what happens if any of this is done incorrectly? So we don't know. I mean, it's the way the statute's written, you just have to pick up and start making payments again, and it's not really clear whether you have a sudden balloon payment or not. It's something that there'll be a discussion about going forward, and as we know more, we will write about it. All right, moving to Roman numeral 9. This is about regulating lending institutions. And one of the things that we're super concerned about is a credit crunch for farmers. Access to credit, loans that are not payable, what happens, all the creditor actions that come down on top of you. And one of the things to remember is that these lenders, all of them, basically, these private lenders, are highly regulated. So the Federal Reserve Board, regulates banks. The Farm Credit Administration regulates farm credit system. Everybody's got a regulator, and they all are looking over their shoulder at what their regulators are thinking and saying. And one of the things that regulators are attuned to is whether you have a bunch of bad loans. Are people unable to pay your loans? So what's happened, which is quite interesting, and I think below the radar in the rest of the broader world, is these regulators have issued a series of statements which basically say, hey, we understand there's a crisis out there. Do something good for your borrowers. And so they issue guidance. And the guidance, is detailed in the guide. But basically what it says is if you're a lender, you need to do things like defer loans, you need to waive fees, let's extend some terms, let's delay payment, grant some more unsecured debt if people need it, let people skip the fees if they're late, make sure to be willing to modify small farm loans. I mean, it's really quite good language in this. It's nothing that you can sort of take in your hand into a bank and say, darn it, make me this loan. Look at what the Federal Reserve said in their guidance. I don't think that moves anybody in a bank, but it moves things in a broader way. And as advocates, it's something that we can push on. There's one interesting guidance letter which says that if you want a better Community Reinvestment Act rating, one of the things that you can do is offer forbearance and make more loans to small businesses and businesses in lending and actions which benefit people who are struggling financially. And there's even some language that says if you can help promote food access, that's also a good thing under the Community Reinvestment Act. So I think it's sort of an interesting policy angle to put pressure on lenders. But again, it's not something that you can march into a bank with and say, give me a loan. On the Roman numeral 10, we have the more what we could call the administrative response by USDA. And so here we have the things that USDA has done or not done that aren't a part of the CARES Act, not a part of any statute. It's just a sort of flexibility that they have. And there's a lot of room here for them to do things. They don't have to go through Congress. They've done some of it, but one could argue they should do a lot more. But basically what's happened so far is that they have sort of closed up the offices. Everybody's got to try to get contact with them on the phone or online. Fair enough, I guess. They don't want people traipsing in there. But that's a real problem for farmers. And so at a minimum, people are going to have to use the phone. So one of the interesting things that triggers is, well, what about the receipt for services? Not everybody in this call will be familiar with this, but it was a long struggle to try to force FSA in particular to treat people fairly. And one of the ways that it was really essentially needed to treat people fairly is to let people know, what the answer is to their question and acknowledge their question and acknowledge it in writing. And so that you have a farm bill requirement of a receipt for services. And what USDA has said now is that they'll do it for phone calls as well. And what our fear is that in the midst of the crisis, this sort of accountability regulation falls through the cracks. And so that's something that we wanted to emphasize. FSA still has to do those, and now they need to do them if you talk to them on the phone. In terms of direct and guaranteed loans, FSA could become an increasingly important source of credit for borrowers, for farmers in a crunch here. FSA for their direct loans says that they're extending some deadlines. They're doing little things around the edges that in theory make it easier to get the loan. In theory, they're also extending deadlines for loan servicing if people get behind in their loans. They're not going to foreclose on people right away if you have a farm loan, which is good for a direct loan. For guaranteed loans, there's actually less. And here the problem is always that guaranteed lenders can use loan servicing and get reimbursed by USDA because it's a guarantee, but they unfortunately often prefer to foreclose rather than restructure. And so FSA is telling lenders, hey, don't forget that you can request deferral or servicing, and it would be great if lenders would do that. We think as a legal matter, USDA has the authority to defer a lot of debt. And if they just would do it, and Farm Aid and others are in active conversations to try to convince the agency to do that. Thus far, they haven't. If they do, we will certainly write about it. Roman numeral 11, crop insurance and NAP. The first thing to say here is that, as we know, crop insurance is sort of the pot of gold in agricultural funding now. I mean, you know, crop insurance once was sort of a straight up program of insuring your crops. Now it's a way to get money to producers. And so that's $8 billion a year. 2/3 of your insurance premium for crop insurance is paid by the government. This is a really good program if it works for your operation. So it's quite important what happens here. The first thing to note is that COVID-19 is not an insurable loss. For people who have crop insurance programs that cover their revenue one way or another, like through whole farm, then that's gonna, then COVID-19 will affect you. But you know, if you just buy conventional crop insurance on your corn and beans, you know, COVID-19 is not really affecting your yields, so it's not an insurable loss in any way. So everybody, pretty much everybody who's got crop insurance this year already has it. It's nothing to buy now. The thing that I really, really want to emphasize is that if you make rational changes to your farming operation, you have got to tell crop insurance provider, your private provider, or if you are involved in the NAP program, non-insured assistance program for disasters. I just botched that name, but NAP, basically crop insurance where there isn't crop insurance, run by FSA. If you're going to start making changes, you have got to tell either your insurance provider or USDA. And here's a scenario that's really worrisome. Somebody realizes after they bought crop insurance or after they signed up for NAP, they're not going to have a market for a particular crop. So they think, hey, why should I grow that? There's nothing, no place to sell it. I'll just do something else. That's what, you know, a sane person and a good business person would do. Unfortunately, you might have violated your crop insurance contract or your NAP agreement. So the crucial thing is to go in, talk to people, figure out what you can do, let them know, and get some verification. Don't just do the rational, sane thing, but not tell them. Roman numeral 12 here is state, local, tribal courts and programs. And not to be a Debbie Downer here, but this is important in kind of a bad way, in the sense that debts are going to come due, creditors are not going to be shy in collecting them, and the courts are still open. I mean, they're crippled a little bit in terms of how they function, but they are not closed. And people need to answer their mail, they need to figure out the way to respond to summonses. Everything that goes down once you can't pay a debt that goes to the court system it will not be suspended unless somebody suspends it. I mean, your state legislature could do it, but the courts are not going to stop collecting debts, and the creditors are not going to stop coming. Again, you know, the courts have changed their rules, but they're still functioning. The one set of people, I hate to be mean, but the one set of people who's secretly kind of delighted by all of this are lawyers, because can you imagine the lawsuits that are going to come out of the insurance claims, the contracts that are broken? Oh my goodness, it's just people are salivating out there for all the lawsuits that are about to happen. This is going to affect farmers too, and you know, it's not like our crew of farmers is going to be hired an army of lawyers, but if you had a contractor that was broken, it's an interesting issue, and everybody's going to be trying to do what they can to get a remedy, but we are about to see a tidal wave of lawsuits. A similar point to remember is that state, local, tribal governments will have programs. They will almost none of them be designed to help agriculture, but they still could also help farmers. So for example, if your state says no foreclosures anywhere for a certain period, that's going to help you, or no evictions. These are the sorts of things that happened after the 2008 crash. One of the things that we noticed was that they were never written with farmers in mind, so it's super confusing what they actually do, but they are worth keeping track of. 3 more points. Roman numeral 13. From the first time that I ever started working at FLAG a long time ago, scams popped up, scams targeting struggling farmers. It never goes away. There's not much to say, except if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. The scams that are arising now are about getting out of mortgages, getting access to programs. People have got to be super careful. And you know, I've read about this a lot. You've got to be really careful. And we are about to hear some sad stories. So please, when you talk to people, if they seem to have found a super great way to get out of this mess, they've got to make sure it's for real. Roman numeral 14 is discrimination. At FLAG, one of our priorities over the long haul has been to make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to make a living farming and a chance to thrive and succeed in agriculture. You know, there's a tendency to think that all farmers are white men. We know that's not true. We also know that from USDA to banks to other institutions, there's been a very long-standing pattern of discrimination. You know, it's no secret USDA has paid out billions in lawsuits about their own discrimination out of USDA offices. There's no particular reason to think that this all suddenly stopped. And so the thing that we would emphasize is that discrimination in these programs is not just wrong, it's illegal. And now in particular, when we're talking about credit, we're talking about lending, these are exactly the sort of scenarios where discrimination occurs. It's illegal. The final thing that I wanted to mention here is number 15, appeals and accountability. And that is simply, we've got a lot of money floating around out there, a lot of it allocated in a super big hurry, and very little thought has been given to how this will actually go down in a way that makes sure there's fairness. They're going to be looking for fraud. They may use that authority fairly or unfairly. We don't know in a lot of these cases if there even is an appeal system. I mean, for SBA, there is, but it's a weird one. If, you know, USDA has its appeal system, but it's also confusing. For some of these other programs, we don't even know. So when you see things that are super unfair, I think it's important to raise them. Let's distribute them. Let's try to think through the sort of options that people have instead of just taking no as the final answer. Lindsay, did I skip anything important or not? Yeah. What did I skip that was important, Lindsay?
I don't think you skipped anything, and we're right in the hour window, so I think we're set.
Yeah, I'm so impressed. And I think the last point you lifted up, Stephen, is really critical, that this is the real-time space where we're going to start connecting the dots between how do we try to save this farm to how can we try to save all farms. And the conversations that start to unfold between this community and those of us in this community who work on the Hill or work in state legislatures becomes really critical to making sure we get the best possible outcome. So we're going to turn over to Q&A. Lindsay, I know that there were a few that you already were starting to bring answers to. Maddie and or Annie, do you want to go through the list you've pulled together from our audience before we open up the lines for conversation? And just remember, you may have to unmute yourself.
I can start to go through some of the SBA ones that were sent in. The first one from Rosa was asking if there were any funds set aside for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers.
I think the short answer is no, right, Lindsay?
Yeah, the short answer is no. One of the things, and this is not specific to that, but I guess somewhat related, and I just posted this, that there is now some targeted funding for smaller banks. So to the extent that people have not had access to PPP loans because they don't have large banks in their area that have been servicing those, there's now $30 billion set aside for certain CDFIs and another $30 billion for kind of small mid-range size banks. So that, to Rosa's questions, no, there's nothing set aside for certain types of farmers, but hopefully the areas have expanded where you can actually access the loans. So.
Thanks. The next one was, is it known how many applicants there were for EIDL before it closed?
Yeah, so, and this was, I was just about to post this. There's actually, if you go on SBA's EIDL website, at the very bottom, I think they have a link to their, they call them reports, and they listed as of April 20th, and I believe the numbers, so as of April 20th, which was before the Enhancement Act came out, so this would have been in that first wave of funding, they had approved 38,984 EIDL loans, and then $1,192,519 in terms of the advances. So I don't know how frequently they update that, but you can look on their website to see, and they break it down by state too, which for some of you all may be interesting to see those numbers. I'll try to find the link and put that in the chat.
Thanks. Someone else asked, if you're filing a Schedule C or F, how do you designate the owner's drawdown as payroll?
I would say, so one of the things in the guide, and I think it's around, and Stephen, correct me if you want to chime in, around pages 22 to 25 of the guide, we kind of walk through how they do the calculations with Schedule C, like which lines you need. And there has been some guidance. So I know line 34 of Schedule F, which I'm, off the top of my head, I can't tell you what that line is. They use that line in the calculation, but I would first say to look at those pages of the guide to see if that helps answer. If it doesn't, feel free to email us and we can try to get you a more precise answer, unless Stephen, you want to fill in.
I would just say that the tricky part of this and kind of the unfortunate part is if you don't show a profit, essentially, they're going to say you're at zero. So kind of what they do is they say, what is your profit? And then they sort of take a percentage of that. That's the way they sort of get at what your employment pay would be as a self-employed farmer. That sound right, Lindsay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, the next one was, can you qualify for the EIDL if you do not have a net profit in 2019?
Oh, just want to make sure I wasn't on mute. So I don't believe there was any requirement of needing profit for EIDL that I've seen. Have you, Stephen?
That's correct.
Okay. The next one was, is there any insight into how they're calculating the emergency advanced amount? Roger said their co-op and one other small business he knew basically got $1,000 per employee, full or part-time.
So my understanding of the reading of the CARES Act itself, just limits those advances to a maximum of 10,000, and there's nothing that I've seen in there that says how they calculate that, but that does seem to be what SBA is doing. And I have been struggling, they release kind of information again in this ad hoc way, and it's hard to trace it back because they just kind of paste over it. So I think you're right that what they're doing is $1,000 per employee up to a max of 10, but it isn't in the actual CARES Act itself, and I can't point you to anything authoritative at this point, but we can look for that just to confirm.
It's hard to know what they think what they must think they're doing. Who knows?
Okay, I think that covers the specific SBA questions. So I don't know if we want to open it up to other folks if they have questions before moving on to some of the other ones.
Yeah, so if you have a question about the SBA programs, you can unmute yourself, or I can take that. I'll do this. I'm gonna unmute everybody, but I reserve the right to mute everyone back, and you may have to unmute yourself. So if you have a question about SBA, go ahead and ask it.
If you want to send it to Grant's mom's email. Okay. Address. You don't have to say anything, just say any benefits, and then just
maybe that's not.
I'm gonna mute. And just unmute yourself if you have a question.
I have a question, Alicia and crew. For the SBA, now I can't remember, grants, I think, are those applications, I understand they're not taking any new applications, but is the application itself still up and available so farmers could start filling it out and be ready if and when they open up again with more money?
So they don't, well, actually, before I say that, I was going to say I don't believe they have it now on their website since they're not taking it. We can check our links from previous guides to see if any of them still bring you to the application. The one caveat, and Stephen, if you want to chime in on this, I would say is that because there's been a huge change that affects farmers in this application, and the previous one, had language that said you are not eligible if you're an agricultural enterprise, I don't know in what ways they're going to be changing it. So to the extent the old one might give you a sense of what information you need, it could be useful, but it could also be misleading if they decide to change it quite a bit. Stephen or anyone else,
So I think that the short answer is no, that there is not an application out there because they don't want you to fill it out and submit it. I mean, this is the way they turn the spigot off, is they say, sorry, you have to apply through us, and it's not here. So unfortunately.
Other SBA related questions? Does anyone want to lift up, there was a question prior about farmer-friendly banks. And if there are any, does anyone, maybe what we should do is in the chat box, folks can share and just say what their coverage is if there's a specific geographic coverage. So for those of you out there who know of them. And we'll try to collect all the information that's coming out of these side conversations to bring back to everybody who participated in this call.
I mean, this is Stephen. I mean, if this is like other disasters, we are going to have a really big problem with people getting credit. And, it doesn't matter if interest is very low. If people don't make loans, and if people can't pay back loans, they go delinquent. We're going to have a problem. And so, Farm Credit System needs to get it together and make better and more loans, and FSA needs full funding and they need to be available. I mean, this really worries me quite a bit.
Maddie,
So I have one question.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. So Stephen and Lindsay, could you just reiterate again? So like, especially the EIDL is not available right now for people in agriculture, but if it's reopened, there is an opportunity. What should farmers be doing right now to prepare themselves?
I think checking every day on, honestly, SBA's website for when they don't give a lot of advanced warning, or maybe we'll hear it through the pipeline, but I really think the best thing is just to be, at least given historically in the past few months how the money has gone, that you want to be applying as soon as you can. And since you don't need to go anywhere except the SBA website, my first advice is to just be checking constantly.
I mean, the few pages of our guide on EIDL are as extensive a discussion as you're going to find about how this works for farmers. So I think that's one place to go.
Do we know anything about standard forms or the type of documentation people would need? No, okay. All right.
The only thing I would say on that, Alicia, is they did, with the loan part of the EIDLs, they relaxed some of SBA's like traditional requirements for those. So you don't need personal guarantees on, you know, loans under a certain amount, and they should be looking at your credit, and I think they say other appropriate or sources, but you shouldn't need tax forms, I don't believe. So I would say the guide kind of, I think we outline those relaxed requirements if people wanted to get a sense.
Last call for SBA questions before we move to other sections of topics in the guide. All right, Maddie, what were sort of the next set of questions?
Yep. Someone asked, who will make the determination on whether FSA requires a farm number, and what will that process look like?
I'll start on this, Sarah. You should jump in here. The statute doesn't say. So I think FSA's first impulse will be to sort of get everybody that they give money to into their system. So I'm not going to be surprised if they don't, you know, want you to sort of do all the paperwork, all the forms, get a farm number, just as if you were doing any other FSA thing. And it creates a significant barrier for people who are not been a part of the FSA, USDA world. We got lots of people out there that never stepped into a county office, and you know that's of course their decision, and nobody can, you know, there are people that do not want any part of USDA. Fair enough, but if you want to participate in these programs, I think my guess is you're going to have to fork over the information and etc. Sarah, what's your take?
That is, yeah, we share that take, Stephen. They're not required to, but it's ultimately their decision because Congress didn't give them directions on it. And we asked for them not to require one, but we are concerned that they may. So if you work with populations of farmers for whom this is especially going to be a barrier, that's something to watch closely for. And we'll be continuing to press as hard as we can to look for any and all channels to make sure that folks who don't have one may still be able to get aid in some way. But yeah, same analysis.
One question that came up that Sarah had answered in the chat, but I just wanted to lift up, was from John Hansen, who was asking, relative to the USDA disaster direct payments, how will farmers document losses if they decided to not sell grains, oil seeds, or wheat at the depressed price levels? Does that count as experiencing a loss?
Yeah, and I'll just to repeat what we indicated in the chat, we don't yet know how they're going to ask for loss documentation or how broadly they're going to define loss and what's going to count as documentation to suffice. So I wish we knew. That's a great use case. That's a great example. If you have other examples of the kinds of losses or impacts you felt that you're concerned about with regards to documentation, please feel free to either share them with us directly or put them in the chat box, because that's really helpful information that we can take to USDA as the process moves forward.
I mean, and as you deal with farmers now, I mean, the more records they can accumulate as to exactly this sort of development, the better. And legally, it's a strange thing, but if you have what the law calls a contemporaneous document, that's best. And so contemporaneous means you lost your market today, write it down in a folder. I lost my market today. That's much more valuable, weirdly enough, 6 months from now than your recollection. Mm-hmm. So sort of a sequence. They closed the farmer's market. I called. It's shut down. I tried to go here. I tried to go there. I sold X bushels for Y. I mean, just a narrative of what happened to you, with or with documentation is great, but documentation includes your own contemporaneous experience. So write it down.
What I would triple underscore to that, Stephen, is what we know about what people's bodies and minds are doing when they're in stress, and why your mind might be a sieve when it tries to remember. So it's also just smart, really, for all of you and how you think about working with farmers anyways, to think through whether it was COVID or otherwise. When someone is in stress, all the more so you're going to have to work with them on writing things down, things that you would assume they're very adept at, which they are. Everybody is less adept at in a time of stress. And so I think it's a good practice to tell people to write things down overly, have someone else write something down for them if they're in a conversation, even if it's over the phone, so that there's that other witness there.
Can I kind of have a follow-up question to that? So, you know, in Ohio and I think elsewhere where, you know, production for, you know, produce growers, their season is starting. And so there's concern about what their losses are going to be. It's not that window of January to April. It's now through the season. And, you know, what comes to mind, an example that we have is like a beginning farmer who her market plan was to sell at this farmer's market. And because of social distancing, she is not going to be able to participate in that particular farmer's market. So, you know, I know that there's nothing we can do, but I guess just how do we hang in this position, and what do we tell them, and what do we need to do as advocates?
And I can just hi Renee, one piece just briefly on the loss documentation, underscoring everything that Alicia and Stephen said, even if, like, keep documenting even beyond that April period. What we understand them to be doing is prioritizing losses from January to April, but that they will still also pay out for losses afterward, just at a lower percentage. That could change during the rulemaking. That may be an advocacy opportunity for us to make a case. So again, back to that documentation. If farmers can demonstrate, in fact, my losses have gotten worse after this time period, that's really helpful for us to understand and take back, one, to make a case for aid, and two, to advocate for fixes in the program.
I mean, not to be too snide, but, you know, USDA is really used to writing checks to like big growers.
Yes.
You know, and they know how to do that. Like, okay, your soybean check, here it comes. But when it comes to this sort of stuff, they don't have a lot of practice. They don't have a lot of knowledge. It's like pulling teeth to get them to do it right. And we're the ones that have to, like, hold them accountable. I mean, I hate to be harsh, but, you know, they will not do this correctly if they don't have pressure to do so.
We're the dentists, says David. That's right. But it's where, you know, particularly for this community that's working with us on relief funds, it's where we become, what we're doing becomes this bridge towards further stages of recovery. And sometimes that becomes hard to articulate about why we think it's strategic, but part of the reason is then you're in these touch points with these growers and can start learning and figuring out how we need to adapt as a fuller community. There was a question about whether a voice recording could be considered the same as written for documentation. I'm just trying to capture some quick questions still on this topic.
Does this mean a one-sided taping of a phone call? I hate to be the lawyer in this, but writing is best. Writing is best, and if you've got a voicemail, save it. If it's legal to tape record a conversation in your state, I guess, okay. But an email or written is by far the best. And if you had a verbal confirmation, write it down. I talked to FSA on April 28th. This person said X. That's actually valuable.
Mm-hmm.
I just have to say, Stephen, we appreciate having lawyers in the room. We need you, so thank you. And thank you for wearing a tie, too. That was really...
You may or may not be interested to know that was an active point of conversation in prepping for this call, was whether or not Stephen was wearing a tie. So Michael Wall from Georgia Organics, hi Michael, asks, how did they accept loss documentation for recent natural disasters?
For recent natural disasters, how did they accept, I'm sorry again, Tim, say again.
How did they accept loss documentation?
There's a wide variance. I mean, if you have crop insurance rules are very particular about the sort of documentation, and each USDA program is a little different, but basically the more documentation, the better. For disasters, if you have a flood, a picture, I mean, I hate to be gruesome, but a picture of dead cattle wrapped up in barbed wire, that's a good piece of documentation. It's a little harder to do it now. It's just less evident. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
I would say keep going, Maddie, unless someone pipes in.
Okay. Steve asked, Stephen, do you have a direct link to the CRA for the Food System Providers Note?
Send me an email. The answer is yes.
What's your email, Stephen? You can type it in the chat. Yeah.
Can I just do this to everybody? I'm gonna send it to everybody.
Great.
Okay.
I wanted to point out, if people aren't familiar with Zoom, that you can download the chat before it closes. So it's where those those little dots are at the bottom right-hand corner, and then you can capture the whole conversation.
Yeah, save chat is where you push. Maddie, other questions?
Yep. Rosa asked, is the receipt for service over the phone something that will only be in place during the pandemic, or will it extend beyond?
Interesting question, and I can look it up to make sure, but I think it's only temporary, but with no set date for it to expire. I can look it up though. You send me an email if you.
Okay. One of the questions on crop insurance was, what are the impacts on revenue insurance?
For crop insurance, the number one rule is read the policy, and they do vary somewhat, and so for your big revenue policies, I think your revenue is your revenue, so it sort of locks into what the policy says for those calculations. For the sort of big money normal revenue policies, I would talk to your, as they call it, the AIP, your insurance provider, and they should understand those rules really well. But the thing to really remember is this policy is really ironclad. So follow all the rules, give all the notice. If your policy says you have to try to sell a crop, if it's the final price and you choose not to sell it, you may have violated the policy. So we're going to end up with some very strange scenarios where your crop insurance people are going to want you to sell things at an incredible discount, very likely, as opposed to plowing them under, unless you get permission in advance. So as I was trying to say, don't do the rational thing without telling crop insurance or NAP people what you're doing and get an approval.
Okay, the next question was, are farm home mortgages held by USDA subject to the same 180-day deferment without having to formally service the loan?
Yes, if it's a rural housing loan, for sure. USDA acknowledges that rural housing loans are covered by that. If it's a farm loan program, FO, or it turned out to be almost really mainly a residence with very little farmland, it's not decided, but I would make the argument that it is covered.
Okay.
I have a feeling FSA will not, that's not what they'll conclude right away, but still.
Okay, and then I think the last question is, states that have received CARES Act funds to address business and local business impacts, has anyone been tracking how that's unfolding?
Not flag. Sorry.
So I think what we can do then is, if folks want to keep asking questions, go ahead, and we'll use the remaining time for that. We'll be sending follow-up communications to folks who have to hop off now. And we want to hear your feedback. So included in that will be a very quick feedback form so that we can learn what was helpful for you, what worked, what didn't, and improve, because likely this will be the first of some other ones of these that we do. This is very needed, we know. But for those of you staying on with more questions, go ahead. Just remember, you may be on mute. Trying to think if there were any other. Is there any talk about regulatory changes for addressing supply chain breakdowns, specifically around meat processing?
You mean besides the Defense Act that Trump's using? That's, I don't know. Anybody else? Sarah?
It's a big question.
So did you just see the JBS announcement that just came out? That they've got it covered. They can ramp up production in other countries and get the meat to us to fill the shelves. So
From Brazil.
yeah.
Yeah, I did.
Goodbye, rainforest. Thank you, JBS.
We all whine about it, but the livestock producers need help to stay there. But it's really just a direct subsidy to JBS Brazil, because they're not paying what the meat is worth. And we all know that. But here we go again. Now they're going to corner the market with imports.
Yeah, and just to add on the regulatory side, there is definitely talk about it. I would say if you have ideas or specific needs that you're seeing in the field, please get them up to us, to NSAC or to FarmAid or anybody else on this call. Those are definitely in dialogue and discussion, both around what kind of administrative flexibility is USDA able to offer already, and two, regulatory changes that might need congressional authorization. There will be another aid package of some sort coming down the line. We don't know the exact timing, but now is the time to be generating those ideas and needs for the next package. So opportunity, it's still possible. It won't be moving with the speed that any of us know is needed, but keep the ideas coming and please send them up, because there may be opportunities. Oh, and thank you, David, for the acronym check there.
Any other questions from those who are still on? You have another 4 minutes to tap these brilliant minds.
Because I'm interested in knowing any more about the Community Reinvestment Act. I know it sounds like you have a link of some sort that you can send us, but are there some thoughts or ideas going through your minds in terms of how to connect with banks at this time and use that particular piece?
So it's a few years ago now, but there was an effort by family farm folks, especially the National Family Farm Coalition and people that were members of it, to really try to use the Community Reinvestment Act to force lenders to serve low income and small scale farms and farmers. And it kind of withered, the effort kind of withered away. I can point you to the act. I can point you to activists who are using it, especially for like redlining for housing and stuff like that. And we always argued that it's equally applicable for farms in rural areas. It's just been hard to get, you know, people fired up to do stuff, the regulators. But I would like to think that this can can be used to pressure banks to do more to help people. So I'm happy to send you what the stuff that I have, but it's not like there's a preformed effort to get out there right now that I know about on farm stuff, I have to say.
Dan, you said you maybe hopped on at the wrong time. Were there any questions we could answer for you?
Not really. I don't think I know enough to ask. I just realized it was Eastern time rather than Central, and I missed that. Sorry.
That's okay.
There's a book out. There's a guide out there. You're not very far behind.
Yeah, okay.
And we'll be doing more of these.
Okay, great.
I have a quick question. It might not be super kosher, but you mentioned that creditors might be quick to take up any of the aid that farmers receive. Is there any type of tactics that they can use to try and keep that money, as in like cash it real quick or something like that? I mean, is there any advice that we can give in that regard?
Okay, so you're now talking about a wide variety of laws. So this is a nationwide question, but we got 50 states, we've got tribal courts. In general, creditors can take money. What they're going to be able to try to do is A, take money out of bank accounts if it sits there, and B, take money that they feel like they have a right to because they have a lien or first dibs on that check. I'm not going to be surprised if somebody out there doesn't claim that for these USDA checks, they don't have a lien on it based on some prior debt and some prior security agreement. And I would expect there would be a fight about it. I don't know. I mean, Sarah, maybe you know this, whether USDA intends to offset these payments for, let's say you're late on your FSA farm loan program payment. I don't know. It would be within their capacity to. So I guess the short answer is the same laws apply, and it's less like any other money you have in your account. If it sits in a checking account, it's more vulnerable than if it's being used in some other way. But you don't want to violate your security agreements. You don't want to default on a loan by trying to hide proceeds, etc. But I think in general, the USDA payments will not trigger that. Well, we'll find out, I guess.
Okay, thanks.
I know that's not a very helpful answer.
That's okay.
The only thing I'll add is I'm really glad you raised that question, and I can take that back to our team and the folks who specialize on credit, and just make sure that's in our hopper for if we are able to get some direct lines into USDA with questions. That's a really good question to raise.
That's a really good point, Sarah. I mean, the Treasury offsets are statutory, and so there's a sort of a machinery here that once people get locked into an offset, it's sort of hard to get out. But if Congress could eliminate all of it, I mean, and that's what they did with these first Treasury checks. They said the government will not offset it.
Yep.
So there's no reason they shouldn't do this for farmers if they cared to.
Yep.
And we've been pushing to remove that offset in the debt relief bill going around Gillibrand's office, and that will be introduced in the House side today. I mean, this is an ongoing issue when we look at fixes around credit and debt for the farm sector in general. House sponsor for that bill is Representative Maloney will be introducing it today. And I believe they're getting a pretty robust New York rep delegation as co-sponsors, but they may have added since the last time I spoke to them. And there is, David, I can share a sign-on if you want to support it. Well, we're at time, so great. So we will be sharing the recording and the materials. We have lots of areas for follow-up. I'll also have the list of email addresses for those who were speaking today. Some of you I'll be talking to in mere hours, others in another day or two as we have our next round of conversations about the relief funds that you're all pulling together. So hopefully this got everybody out on the right foot, and we'll be talking to you all real soon. Hang in there, we're with you.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks, guys. If speakers want to hang on for just a minute, cool. Let me see. Okay, I know there's still some people on. Thanks, everyone. Mm-hmm. Just give me a second. I think I got this. Okay. All right, everybody else is in the waiting room.
All right, do you want to stop the recording?
Yes.